I'm Emily Parker, 34, the daughter my father once called a disappointment, the sister my family trained to stay in the shadows. Tonight, I stopped being their silence. At our table, Olivia always shone. Every toast, every smile, every ounce of pride was hers. Mine, dismissed as mistakes, erased like I didn't exist. But the invitation to Thanksgiving at La Lumiere wasn't just a seat at their table, it was a challenge. And I don't run from challenges anymore. Ever been erased by the very people who should have lifted you up? Hit like if you've ever been overlooked in your own family. Comment if you know the sting of being the invisible one. It all began the moment I stepped into La Lumiere, beneath chandeliers too bright to forgive, and realized they weren't ready for who I had become. The thought slipped through me like a quiet spark, igniting memories I wished had burned out long ago. The invitation had sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days, a thin envelope in Margaret's familiar looping script, Thanksgiving dinner at La Lumiere. A family tradition, though I had not been invited in years. This time the words were polite but perfunctory. You should come. Emily, it would be nice to have everyone together. No warmth, no apology, just duty wrapped in expensive stationery. I picked it up more than once, thinking of tearing it in half and tossing it away. But then the echo of Richard's voice came back to me, the memory as sharp as glass. I will not waste my money on an MBA for you. You're a disappointment, Emily. Olivia has the discipline. You're nothing but dreams. That night was a decade ago, yet the sting had never left. Every success I carved out afterward carried the faint aftertaste of that humiliation. So I told myself sometimes the best revenge requires walking into the lion's den. The city outside my window glowed with late November chill. My penthouse was spare by design. White walls, clean lines, the hum of Manhattan muted by double-glass panes. A space built to remind me that I had done this on my own. No family handouts, no father's approval, no safety net. Tonight, as I paced across polished floors, the invitation burned against my skin like a challenge. My phone buzzed. Olivia, always perfectly timed, always needling, don't embarrass us tonight. Just 5 words, clipped and dismissive, as if she still believed she held the higher ground. I could almost hear her smug tone, see her smug smile. For a moment I considered replying, but silence was the sharper blade. I went to the closet, letting my fingers brush against fabrics that spoke of power rather than wealth. Sequins and velvet would have screamed for attention. I wanted restraint, authority. A simple black dress hung in the corner, sleek, understated, elegant. I slipped it on, fastening the zipper slowly, savoring the feel of armor sliding into place. No need for glitter when control could be worn like a second skin. As I stood before the mirror, the past pressed in again. Richard's voice, cold and final. Margaret's silence, her gaze darting away rather than defending me. Olivia's smirk, sharpened by triumph, as she slid into the role of favored daughter. My family had carved their hierarchy years ago, and I had been the footnote they refused to read. But tonight, things had shifted. They didn't know how much. I adjusted the neckline, smoothed the fabric, studied the woman looking back at me. Stronger, sharper. My pulse thudded in my ears, not with fear, but with anticipation. Revenge wasn't about shouting or spectacle. It was about timing, patience, presence. About showing up when they least expected it, and letting them realize too late that the balance of power had already changed. The phone on the counter glowed again, Olivia's message waiting like a dare. I let it sit there, unacknowledged, as I leaned closer to the mirror. My reflection held my gaze, unflinching, unreadable. Slowly, deliberately, I whispered to her, to myself, to the ghosts of every insult that had ever been flung my way. Let them try. The Parkers never entered a room. They staged a parade. It was true the moment we stepped out of the sleek black town car and onto the polished stone steps of La Lumiere. Richard adjusted his cufflinks like a general surveying his troops, chin lifted, chest puffed, as if the sidewalk itself were a runway designed for his stride. Margaret followed with practiced grace, her gown the color of winter roses, her diamonds catching every streetlight. And Olivia floated, every movement deliberate, her heels clicking in a rhythm that demanded notice. To them, the restaurant doors were not an entryway, but a curtain parting on their private stage. I trailed behind, the cool November wind tugging at the hem of my black dress. Not a brand name worth bragging about, not a designer custom fit just mine, chosen for what it whispered rather than shouted. The maitre d' bowed with trained elegance, his eyes sliding past me, as if I were no more than a shadow. Richard's voice filled the lobby, booming, confident, shaking hands with wealthy acquaintances who had been waiting to be noticed. He laughed too loudly, the kind of laugh that begged to be overheard. Hospitality is for those without ambition, he had once told me when I was 12, as he swept out of a charity gala early, muttering about wasted time. The phrase stuck with me now, watching him perform magnanimity for strangers, shaking hands as if granting favors. Ambition cloaked in arrogance, that was the Parker way. We passed beneath the chandeliers, light dripping like molten gold from the crystals overhead. Waiters bowed with near-military precision, their white gloves gliding as they pulled out chairs, poured wine, arranged silverware. The scent of butter and truffles lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of wealth and expectation. "Ah, Olivia," one guest murmured as we moved toward our table, "that gown is exquisite." Olivia smiled, gracious in a way that said she expected nothing less. She brushed a hand across my arm as if to steady me, then leaned closer, her whisper sharp enough to cut silk. "At least you showed up in that dress." Her eyes flicked downward, dismissive, a smirk curving her lips. The comment was soft enough for only me to hear, yet it reverberated louder than Richard's laugh across the room. I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, unsettled them more than rebuttal. We took our seats, Richard at the head of the table like a monarch, Margaret beside him, Olivia to his right. Mine was left at the far edge, half turned from the glow of attention. The seat of an outcast invited more for optics than inclusion. The chatter swelled around us, friends of the family dropping in with compliments, air kisses, stories of investments and summer homes. My presence barely registered. Richard lifted his glass, voice lowering just enough to be intimate, but not enough to be private. "Some people don't belong here." His gaze settled on me, brief, cutting, disguised behind the rim of crystal and the glow of candlelight. It was not a declaration. It was an old truth restated. Emily Parker, the one who had chosen her own path, the disappointment, the anomaly. I felt the weight of it, but did not flinch. My fingers rested lightly on the stem of my glass, steady, patient. Across the room, a movement caught my eye. The head waiter, James Lee. He paused as he directed his staff, his gaze locking with mine for the briefest instant. His nod was discreet, nearly imperceptible, but it carried something unexpected recognition. Not the kind of recognition reserved for a last name or a famous father, but something else. And in that moment, as the laughter of my family swirled around me, as Richard toasted another acquaintance and Olivia posed like a jewel on display, I held onto that single gesture. Quiet, subtle, but alive with meaning. James Lee knew me, and he wanted me to know it. The wine list was thicker than the resume Dad once said I'd never have. The leather-bound tome slid across the linen with a soft weight, its gold-embossed cover gleaming in the candlelight. I touched it lightly, almost amused at how absurdly heavy it felt, pages upon pages cataloging vintages older than I was, bottles valued at more than a month's rent in my so-called tiny apartment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once I had begged for tuition to pursue my MBA, believing education could shield me from their disdain. Richard hadn't even looked up from his paper that night. "A waste," he'd said, flicking the idea away like ash. "Olivia has discipline. You'll never make anything of it." Now Olivia's voice rose in this room, confident, poised, rehearsed. "The market is brutal this quarter, but I thrive in chaos. Hedge funds are like chess games, you need to think 6 moves ahead." She lifted her glass, the burgundy glinting against the candlelight as if her triumphs were crystallized in the wine itself. Richard beamed, pride sculpted across his face like marble. Margaret's eyes softened with maternal glow. I sat in silence, the outsider, watching the performance play out with a precision honed over years. Every compliment volleyed across the table was for Olivia. Every nod of approval sealed her crown as the Parker heir. Richard leaned back, voice booming so the neighboring tables could catch fragments. "Olivia's condo on Fifth, it's a testament to discipline and smart investing. Not like, well." His eyes flicked toward me, narrowing, dismissive. "Some of us are still squeezing into a tiny apartment. Minimalist, they call it. But in truth, it's just small." Laughter from his throat, polished and cruel. Margaret gave a soft chuckle, delicate, as if excusing the barb by dressing it in silk. My knuckles tightened around the stem of my glass. The insult wasn't new, but the sting remained sharp. Olivia, ever eager to twist the knife, leaned in. "Maybe just water for her tonight. Bordeaux's a stretch. Her words dripped with mockery, wrapped in the sweetness of sibling banter. Yet her smirk betrayed the intention humiliation, public and precise. My chest tightened, a familiar ache pressing against my ribs. Once, these moments had left me breathless with shame. Tonight I let the silence build, a deliberate void she couldn't fill with her own smugness. Then, the sound of measured footsteps. A soft shift in the air. James Lee appeared at my side, posture immaculate, his expression unreadable, yet strangely attentive. In his hands he carried a bottle of Bordeaux. No, not just Bordeaux. A premium vintage, its label unmistakable, one my father would never order casually. He set it down not at Richard's place, nor Olivia's, but directly in front of me. "Compliments of the house," he said, voice low, almost reverent. The cork slid free with a practiced sigh, and he poured carefully into my glass, filling it before any others. The scent rose rich, dark, confident. For a beat too long, the entire table stilled. Richard's brows drew together, the faintest crease of confusion. Olivia's smirk faltered. Margaret busied herself adjusting her napkin, pretending not to notice. I lifted the glass, the crimson swirling like liquid defiance, and caught James's gaze. Something unspoken sparked between us: acknowledgement, recognition, a promise unsaid. The room hummed again with soft jazz and murmured conversations, but for me the world narrowed to that moment, that exchange. And I knew this night had only just begun. Every toast was a jab, every smile a blade. Crystal rang with precision, sharp and deliberate. Each chime another cut masked as celebration. The table gleamed beneath chandeliers dripping with light, every surface too polished, every laugh too pointed. Richard's voice carried across the private room, full and commanding, detailing an investment deal with the air of a man holding court. He leaned forward, cufflinks glinting, his words threaded with numbers, dominance, conquest. Olivia perched at his side like an anointed protégé. "We'll secure the hedge fund in Paris soon," she declared, her tone smooth and triumphant. She smirked as she spoke, a reminder of the evening she once bragged about, the impossible Paris reservation she had flaunted like a crown jewel, proof she could claim anything unattainable. Now her voice wrapped around Richard's with perfect timing, cutting me from the conversation before I could breathe a word. I tried once, actually, in my work, but Margaret's hand fluttered across my arm, the motion soft, maternal, smothering. She hugged me close with a smile far too sweet, her embrace an interruption designed to silence. "Emily, darling, you should just relax tonight. Let us celebrate Olivia's achievements." The wine burned going down, though I barely drank. Laughter roared around me while I sat in a hush, the silence heavy as iron chains. Every word, every look felt calibrated to keep me small. Then Olivia leaned back, her voice pitched just loud enough to slice through the chatter. "It's sad when family has to cover her bills." She sipped delicately, the smirk tugging her lips as the venom hit its mark. Heads turned slightly too polite to stare, yet curious enough to notice. The sting flared hot, but I refused to let it show. I pressed my palm flat against the linen, grounding myself, letting the anger simmer in silence. Years of ridicule had taught me restraint, and tonight I wielded it as armor. A shift came quietly, almost unnoticed. James Lee approached, tray balanced, posture crisp, presence calm. He set the next course before each of them: precision, ritual, perfection. But when he stopped in front of me, something subtle broke the pattern. His eyes caught mine for a fraction longer than service required. Then, in a voice steady yet weighted, he asked, "As usual, Miss Parker." The words lingered, strange, deliberate, carrying a history no one else at the table understood. My name on his tongue sounded different, an acknowledgement, a quiet unveiling. Richard's glass froze mid-air, Bordeaux trembling at the lip. Olivia's fork clinked against porcelain, her frown etching across flawless makeup. Margaret adjusted her pearls, eyes flickering between us, uncertain. And I sat very still, the silence stretching like a fuse, ready to spark. The first crack in their certainty didn't roar, it whispered. At first, it was almost nothing, just a shift in the air. So soft the rest of the room might have missed it. But I caught it. I had been waiting for it. The dining room, once heavy with laughter and polished arrogance, seemed to falter. The chandeliers still dripped light, the crystal still chimed, but something in the rhythm of the night had tilted. James Lee returned, his steps measured, his tray steady as ever, yet the entire table seemed to watch more closely now. He stopped at my side first, lowering a plate not listed on the evening's tasting menu. Steam curled upward, fragrant and familiar. My dish. The one I had always requested when I dined here privately, years ago, before I stepped away. The others received their courses in silence. To me, he gave a quiet bow. A pause, deference. Margaret's smile wavered. Richard's brow furrowed, the first shadow of doubt tracing his face. He cleared his throat. "Why are they treating you like this?" His voice tried for control, but suspicion slipped beneath. I kept my fork poised, not answering. Let him ask. Let him wonder. Olivia's laugh cracked a little too sharply. She bent her head over her phone, thumbs moving with frantic speed beneath the linen glow. The screen lit her features, painting her with the harsh blue-white of panic disguised as poise. Her glass trembled when she set it down too fast. The air stilled as James Lee leaned closer. His voice was calm, but pitched just enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Welcome back, boss." The words struck like a match to dry kindling. Richard nearly dropped his fork, the polished silver clattering against china before he caught it mid-fall. His eyes shot to mine, wide and disbelieving. Margaret's pearls shifted as she inhaled too quickly, the sound of string against clasp. Olivia's screen glowed with fresh search results, the reflection catching in her widening pupils, her smirk faltering as her thumb froze mid-scroll. And me? I didn't move quickly, didn't speak loudly. I only let the corner of my lips curve upward, a slow smile blooming in the silence that had suddenly swallowed the room whole. Silence can be louder than applause, especially when it follows the word boss. The word still lingered in the air like smoke after a match, curling into every corner of the dining hall. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Silverware froze midair, wine glasses hovered unsipped, and across the room a soft jazz melody continued as though unaware that the universe at our table had tilted. I sat still, watching the tremor ripple through my family. Richard blinked hard, his lips parting as if a rebuttal might fall out, but nothing came. Margaret's hand fluttered to her pearls, clutching them with the nervous instinct of someone watching a familiar script unravel. Olivia was the first to break the silence. She let out a brittle laugh, too sharp, too thin, cracking at the edges. "It must be a mistake," she said, her voice pitched just a bit too high. Her manicured fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Around us, other diners had begun to notice. Glances darted toward our table, half curious, half cautious, whispers rising like a tide no maitre d' could hush. James Lee, however, remained impassive, his posture deferential, his gaze steady on me for only a moment before retreating to professional neutrality. The damage had already been done, and he knew it. Richard finally found his voice. It came out rougher than I expected. Anger wrapped around disbelief. "Emily," he demanded, leaning closer, as though proximity might strip away the answer. "What is going on?" His jaw flexed, veins surfacing in his temple. He wanted to slam his fist, but the weight of the room's eyes tethered him to civility. I took my time. I let the music fill the gap between his demand and my response, let the seconds grind against him until his fingers tapped the linen in frustration. Then I lifted my glass, the gesture deliberate, calm, almost lazy. My reflection swirled in the deep red Bordeaux. "You'll see soon enough," I said, my voice even, not a tremor in it. The words didn't roar, they slid across the table like steel. Margaret inhaled sharply, Richard's shoulders stiffened, and Olivia leaned back, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was calculating, her mind already moving, gears turning as quickly as her thumbs had earlier over her phone. She tilted her head, gaze sharp as glass, and I knew what that look meant. She was already plotting her counterattack. Sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It's served course by course. The plates slid onto the table with practiced elegance, porcelain gleaming beneath the chandeliers. Conversations in the room hushed just slightly, as though the restaurant itself understood the moment required reverence. James Lee leaned in, his voice smooth, carrying farther than the pretense of privacy allowed. "Off menu, as Miss Parker prefers." My name carried across the table like a drop of ink in water, spreading silently but visibly. Richard's brows furrowed deeper, lines creasing his forehead like cracks in marble. He reached for his wine with more force than grace, the stem rattling against crystal. Margaret's hand trembled against her pearls again, the same gesture she'd worn since the first reveal, as if clutching them might keep the world orderly. Olivia shifted in her seat, forcing a laugh that sounded too brittle. "Oh, please," she said, waving her manicured hand. This must be some kind of restaurant gimmick. They probably say that to all the customers. Her eyes darted downward, though, phone sliding subtly into her lap beneath the tablecloth. Her thumbs worked quickly, betraying her unease. The dish itself smelled of truffle and rich butter, a signature I hadn't tasted since Chef Laurent had first crafted it years ago. The room's air bent around the plate like gravity, and I caught sight of Laurent himself, hovering discreetly at the kitchen door. He gave the faintest nod, one only I would understand. Gratitude, loyalty, memory, it all lived in that single gesture. I had saved his career once, and now he was here to remind the world that debts had weight. Richard stabbed a piece of meat with too much force, chewing like it was an enemy. "Emily," he said, his tone sharp but controlled, "don't play games at this table." He wanted it to sound authoritative, but his voice had lost its command. It trembled at the edges, and he knew it. I placed my fork down gently, my movements deliberate. Silence worked better than protest. The longer I said nothing, the louder their panic grew. Around us, the chatter of other tables blurred into background noise, curious eyes drifting again and again toward our family like moths circling flame. Olivia finally leaned across the table, her perfume sharp, her smile brittle. "Are you seriously pretending you own this place?" The word pretending came out like a dagger, meant to cut and expose. He didn't flinch. I looked her straight in the eye, my tone as steady as the stem of the glass in my hand. "Pretending is your specialty. Mine is building. Every unpaid debt eventually comes due, even if it takes a decade." The stem of my glass pressed cool against my fingertips as I lifted it slowly, letting the ruby swirl catch the chandelier light. Around me, the table bristled with tension, but my mind slipped backward, unbidden, into the dim hush of Richard's study a decade earlier. The smell of leather and old books had filled the room. His mahogany desk stretched between us like a moat. I had stood on the far side, clutching an acceptance letter that trembled in my hands. "An MBA," I'd said, voice alight with hope. "This is my chance, Dad. With your help, I can." He didn't even let me finish. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his brandy as if its amber depths contained more promise than I ever could. "A waste," he declared flatly. "Finance eats people alive, and you don't have the stomach for it. Olivia's the one with the brains. You'll never survive in that world." The finality in his tone landed like a verdict, heavy and cold. That night, the tuition check never came. The door to his study closed behind me, and with it, the path he decided I couldn't walk. Now, seated at La Lumiere, Olivia's voice dragged me back to the present. "Dad was right," she sneered, lifting her glass with smug precision. "You'd never survive in finance." Her smirk gleamed under the candlelight, sharp as a blade honed for years. I didn't flinch. I let the wine touch my lips, smooth and bold, an answer in itself. The silence unnerved her more than an outburst ever could. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unwilling to meet my eyes. Margaret's pearls clicked faintly as she toyed with them, the only sound in the crackling quiet. Olivia leaned in closer, hungry for a reaction. "You heard me. Admit it, he saved you from humiliation. Finance would have eaten you alive." I set the glass down gently, its sound against porcelain deliberate, sharp in the hush. My voice came low but steady, carrying through the table like a current. Finance wasn't my battlefield. I chose a bigger one. The words landed heavy. For the first time that evening, Olivia froze. The practiced smirk faltered, her fingers stilling on the stem of her glass. She blinked once, twice, then leaned forward, her tone sharpened with something between fear and fury. "Bigger? What do you mean, bigger?" They thought they held the board. They hadn't realized I was the one arranging the pieces. The hum of the dining room had shifted entirely. What began as a background chorus of laughter and silver clinking had thinned into whispers low, curious, sharp-edged. I could feel eyes tugging toward our table, their owners pretending interest in their plates while straining for fragments of what was unraveling here. Olivia was determined to reassert control. Her smile lacquered, her voice pitched louder than needed. "The hedge fund is outperforming all projections," she announced, like a campaign speech to the onlookers. "When the inheritance transfers, it will be the cornerstone for expansion." She tossed her hair, eyes flashing at me, as though daring me to contradict her. Richard leaned forward eagerly, the glimmer of pride in his eyes reserved for her alone. Margaret dabbed her lips with her napkin, casting me an anxious glance she thought subtle. I returned it with nothing but stillness. Let them squirm, I thought. Suspense has always been my ally. Richard finally turned to me, his voice thinner than before, the resonance drained. Emily, he asked again, more brittle this time. How do you know the staff here? His fork hovered halfway to his plate, a frozen metronome marking his unease. I let my gaze drift toward James Lee, who stood poised near the doorway, a shadow waiting for its cue. Instead of answering, I lifted my glass, swirling the red tide lazily. Some connections, I said softly, don't need an introduction. The vagueness struck like a bell, empty yet resonant, drawing curiosity rather than offering relief. Richard's jaw tightened. Olivia rolled her eyes, but the crack in her confidence widened like glass under pressure. The main course lingered half-eaten when James approached, not with a dish this time, but with a leather-bound folder pressed firmly in his hands. He placed it beside me with a deference that carried across the room. His voice, calm but audible, sliced through the brittle air. Final approval for the Tokyo expansion, Miss Parker. A hush fell, as though the chandeliers themselves leaned closer. Richard's fork slipped, clattering against china. Olivia's phone nearly tumbled from her grip as her fingers froze on the screen. Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls as though the strand might hold the world together. I slid the folder open, pen already in hand. Without hurry, without performance, I let the ink flow across the page with a single word: approved. Families rarely explode. They crack, splinter, and collapse under their own weight. The flicker of candlelight painted the edges of crystal glasses and porcelain plates, but whatever warmth the glow promised had long drained away. The room had grown colder, as though the fire that once fueled their arrogance had burned itself into ash. Conversations from nearby tables trickled into silence, guests pretending to be absorbed in their meals while their ears tuned to ours. Olivia was the first to break. Her laugh came sharp, hollow, like glass struck with too much force. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her words carrying just far enough. "You expect us to believe this charade? Emily, you of all people, you couldn't even afford tuition. What is this? Some game? A sugar daddy footing your bills?" She spat the phrase with venom, as though saying it aloud might summon witnesses to her version of truth. Richard stiffened. His eyes flickered not to me, but inward, replaying the chorus of praise from his business acquaintances, who lauded La Lumiere's empire. He had dismissed their words as coincidence, never imagining his estranged daughter could be the architect behind them. Now, that doubt weighed on him like a stone lodged in his chest. Margaret tried to rise above the unraveling. Her hand trembled as she reached across the table, her pearls catching the candlelight. "Please," she whispered, voice fragile. "This is Thanksgiving. Can we not just enjoy dinner?" But her plea cracked under the tension, brittle and ineffective. Even she knew peace was a ghost at this table. Olivia pressed forward, her desperation sharpening into cruelty. "You've always been a fraud," she continued, louder now, daring the room to side with her. "Everything you are is borrowed, begged, or stolen. If you own this place—" She slammed her manicured hand down on the linen, silverware rattling like startled bones. "Prove it!" The sound lingered, a violent punctuation that silenced even the background jazz. Richard's face paled. Margaret flinched. The dining hall collectively held its breath, waiting. I leaned in, slow, deliberate, meeting Olivia's eyes with a calm that cut sharper than any shout. The room bent toward the moment, fragile as glass about to shatter. My voice, steady and low, sliced through the brittle quiet. "Careful, Olivia. Proof cuts deeper than you think." They demanded proof, so I gave it to them, signed in ink and witnessed by the very people they mocked. The chandeliers above cast their golden glow like courtroom spotlights, every glimmering facet sharpening the tension that clung to the air. Diners had abandoned all pretense of privacy. Forks poised halfway, conversations stalled, eyes darting toward our table as though awaiting a verdict. My family, once masters of performance, now sat like defendants, their carefully crafted masks slipping under the weight of silence. James Lee approached, his stride measured, his presence calm, but the leather folder in his hands radiated significance. Behind him, Chef Laurent lingered at a respectful distance, his arms folded, the faintest of smirks betraying his awareness of history being written tonight. He too owed me, though no one else at this table knew just how deep that debt ran. James stopped by my chair, bowing slightly, his voice carrying just enough to reach my family and the nearest guests, without breaking the restaurant's composure. "Miss Parker," he said, offering the folder with both hands. "The final documents for the Tokyo expansion. They require your signature before midnight to meet the board's deadline." Margaret's pearls clinked together as her hand clutched them, a nervous tick she couldn't suppress. Richard's eyes narrowed at the word board as though it struck some invisible nerve. Olivia, however, laughed too quickly, too loudly. "Tokyo expansion?" she scoffed, shaking her head. "This is theater. He's your waiter, Emily. You've bribed him to play this ridiculous part." I didn't answer her immediately. Instead, I drew the folder closer, easing it open with deliberate care. Inside lay crisp contracts, embossed with the La Lumiere crest and countersigned by names the financial press adored. The signatures of power. My pen was already beside the line awaiting mine, black ink ready. I lifted it slowly, the weight of 1,000 doubts pressing on my family while I poised the nib. The room felt as though it leaned in with me, breaths caught in collective suspension. Then, with a steady hand, I signed. Each stroke of ink declared what words never could: ownership, authority, permanence. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was louder than any shout. When I set it down, James closed the folder reverently, tucking it back under his arm. Then, without prompting, he turned to face my father. "As witnessed," he said quietly, "La Lumiere's Tokyo expansion moves forward under Miss Parker's direction." Richard's fingers twitched against his glass, the crystal trembling with the effort to stay steady. Margaret looked at me as though I were a stranger. Olivia leaned forward, eyes wide, lips parting but no sound emerging. For once, she was robbed of words. I raised my gaze and let it sweep across the three of them, resting finally on Olivia's pale face. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried across the dining hall like a gavel striking wood. "Is that proof enough?" The moment cracked. Olivia's chair screeched backward as she surged to her feet, her voice shrill, breaking the room's reverent hush. "This is impossible!" she screamed, her words ricocheting off marble and glass. The declaration wasn't just denial, it was desperation, the last gasp of a sister watching her throne crumble. Envy doesn't whisper, it screams. Olivia's voice sliced through the chandelier, lit hush like glass breaking on marble. The once gilded illusion of Parker unity had shattered, and every diner in La Lumiere leaned closer, pretending to sip wine while devouring every word. A dozen phones tilted discreetly, their cameras angled toward the table where high society's facade crumbled in real time. "You live in a shoebox!" Olivia spat, her manicured hands trembling as she pointed at me. Her cheeks burned crimson, mascara smudged from the sweat of rage. "You tricked us all, Emily. You played poor, pathetic, scraping by when all this time—" Her voice cracked, the disbelief laced with venom. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I placed my hand lightly on my wine glass, turning the stem between my fingers, letting her tantrum echo and collapse in on itself. When I finally spoke, the words were precise, measured, carrying more force than any scream. "That shoebox," I said softly, "is the penthouse of my own building." A ripple of gasps fluttered across the room, sharper than silverware striking porcelain. Diners exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispers swelling like a tide. Penthouse, her own building. The repetition rolled from table to table, disbelief mingled with awe. Richard lowered his head, pressing a broad palm to his face as if shielding himself from recognition, though the gesture only made him more conspicuous. The titan of his circle, once untouchable, now sat in silent shame while his elder daughter's rage unraveled their family name in public. Margaret's lips moved soundlessly, a prayer or perhaps a plea, but no words found form. Olivia, however, could not stop. Her desperation fed on itself, spiraling. "You deceived us for years," she shrieked, pounding the table so hard the cutlery rattled. Crystal glasses wobbled precariously, one toppling and spilling red wine across the linen like fresh blood. My reply was quiet, but it cleaved the air. "No, Olivia, you deceived yourself." Her jaw fell open, a gasp more wounded than any cry. The audience around us, our unwilling jury, leaned in, as if they had witnessed a checkmate. Murmurs thickened. She deceived herself, her sister, all this time. Olivia's hands shook as she dug into her handbag, yanking out her phone with a fury that betrayed panic more than power. She stabbed at the screen, scrolling wildly, desperate to prove me wrong. The glow of the device lit her face in an unflattering blue, making her look hollow, frantic. One by one, her contacts, investors, restaurateurs, even the gossip columnists she once commanded, sent back confirmation. her expression drained with each reply. Finally, her phone slipped from her fingers. It clattered onto the linen with a sound more final than any gavel. She stared at the screen, still glowing, the names and acknowledgments undeniable. With a trembling hand, Olivia shoved it across the table, as though pushing away a venomous snake. Her eyes met mine not with defiance, but with something closer to terror. And then she slammed the phone down again, face twisted, the gesture raw and violent. The screen lit up once more, mocking her with confirmation of my empire. The man who once dismissed me now struggles to measure what I'd built. The silence at our table was unlike any silence I had ever known, not the polite pause of society dinners, not the studied hush of financial negotiations. This silence pressed like stone, crushing every pretense the Parkers had worn as armor. Around us, forks rested untouched, conversations elsewhere dwindled to murmurs, and yet the only sound I heard was my father's shallow breath as he searched for words. Richard Parker, architect of a dynasty, master of boardrooms, breaker of rivals, looked small. His shoulders, once squared with pride, hunched forward as if under an invisible weight. The wine in his glass remained untouched, its ruby glow casting shadows on the trembling of his fingers. His lips parted, and for once in my life, the words he found were not commands or condemnations, but a whisper, frail as paper tearing. "How? Did you do this without us?" The question carried no curiosity, only disbelief, almost fear. I looked at him and saw not the titan who had raised me with cold, rigid hands, but the man who had once stared at a 17-year-old daughter and laughed when she asked for help. MBA tuition? A waste. Real power is in controlling assets. He had said it with such certainty, as though my dreams were fragile glassware destined to shatter in his world of steel and concrete. That dismissal had burned into me, the scar that fueled every sleepless night, every deal I negotiated, every empire brick I laid. Margaret shifted in her seat, her pearls clicking, as her hand fluttered toward his arm. "Richard," she began, her voice quivering with a mixture of pleading and embarrassment. "This isn't the place." But he waved her off with a sharp flick, his eyes never leaving mine. Pride fought shame across his face, and for once, shame was winning. I leaned forward, my hands resting calmly on the linen, my voice steady, each syllable honed, sharper than glass. "You said I'd never sit at the head of any table." My words sliced the air, cutting into the silence until the entire dining room seemed to tilt toward me. "Look around, Dad. Every table here is mine." The chandeliers above glittered in agreement, every waiter's deferential stance reinforcing the truth he could no longer deny. His empire of intimidation crumbled in that instant, brick by brick, until all that remained was an old man staring at the daughter he had tried to bury under his arrogance. Richard's gaze faltered, sliding down to the tablecloth, his chin dipping as though the weight of defeat had finally bent him. The man who had once dismissed me could not lift his eyes, but Olivia could. She hissed across the table, her voice venom wrapped in desperation. "She's bluffing." The words slithered out, brittle and unconvincing, even to her own ears. Mothers are meant to protect, but mine chose appearances over the truth. The candles on the table had burned low, their wax pooling against the gilt holders, shadows stretching long and uneasy across the faces around me. The laughter that once filled this family's dinners had vanished, leaving behind the faint hiss of silence broken only by the soft clinking of cutlery from distant tables. I sat in the center of it, not as a daughter anymore, but as the force that had cracked their illusion. And yet, across from me, my mother's eyes shimmered with tears not shed, her carefully painted smile cracking like porcelain under strain. Margaret reached across the linen, her fingers cold against mine as she clutched my hand as if by holding it she could pull me back into the fragile fantasy she had guarded for decades. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered, her voice low, trembling, almost rehearsed like one of her practiced social niceties. "We worried." The words sounded sweet, but in them I heard the hollowness, the kind of worry reserved, not for flesh and blood, but for headlines and neighbors' whispers. I pulled my hand back slowly, deliberate as a blade leaving its sheath. My voice carried no rage, only truth sharpened by years of neglect. "You worried about your reputation, not me." The stillness that followed was heavier than any scream. Olivia, restless as ever, could not stomach the pause. She snapped, her words sharp and venomous. "And she expects us to applaud her lies? To bow at her little empire?" But before her barbs could land, Margaret's hand struck the air with a rare finality. "Enough. The single word cracked through the tension, silencing Olivia more effectively than I ever could. For once, Margaret's voice carried something like authority, but it came too late. A bandage after the wound had already festered. I let the moment hang before I spoke again, my gaze steady on the woman who had let silence become complicity. Success isn't about flaunting wealth. It's about building something real. I leaned forward, every word deliberate, each one a truth she had refused to see. Something none of you ever saw in me. Margaret's composure crumbled, her shoulders folding inward, as if the weight of her years of denial finally pressed down. Her sobs came softly, muffled by her handkerchief, not the wails of a mother mourning her mistakes, but the quiet shame of someone who realized too late that her silence had been as cruel as Richard's dismissals and Olivia's sneers. Across the table, Olivia's eyes narrowed, her tears absent, her mind calculating. I could almost see the wheels turning behind her glare, rage simmering into strategy, desperation hardening into one final move she hoped could turn the tide. She wasn't finished. Not yet. Apologies means little when the bill has already been paid. The dessert course arrived with quiet ceremony, silver trays gliding under the chandeliers, delicate porcelain dishes crowned with spun sugar and rich cream. A vintage port shimmered in crystal glasses, its ruby glow catching the candlelight. Yet at our table, no one reached for fork or glass. The room's hum carried on around us, but here, in this small island of silence, the aftermath of revelation clung like smoke. Olivia sat stiffly, her hands trembling as her phone glowed faintly beneath the table. The once perfect mask of confidence now cracked, her painted lips pressed into a thin line. A vibration rattled against the linen, and I glimpsed the message she'd forced herself to send. A shaky apology, reduced to a handful of stilted words. Across from her, Margaret leaned in, her voice a whisper wrapped in pleading, her eyes red and swollen. "Forgive us, Emily, please. We didn't know. Her words collapsed into a sob, fragile and incomplete. Richard had no words left. His shoulders sagged, his glass untouched. The once commanding man now hollow-eyed, staring into the depths of wine as though it might give him back his pride. The weight of decades of arrogance pressed down on him, and for the first time in my life he looked small. I didn't answer Margaret's plea. Instead, I lifted my phone, my fingers steady as I opened the family group chat, the same thread where holiday messages and passive-aggressive reminders had accumulated like dust. My pulse didn't quicken, my breath didn't falter. I typed with care, each word deliberate, each keystroke sealing what had already been carved into truth. On the screen, my message stood stark and final. Reservations required. 3-month waitlist. No exceptions. The effect was immediate. Olivia's gasp split the silence, sharp and incredulous, her nails clattering against her phone as though she could claw the words away. Richard exhaled in a shudder, the fight leaving him completely, his gaze falling to the tablecloth. Margaret wept openly now, dabbing at her cheeks, caught between regret and despair. I set the phone down beside my plate and lifted my fork. The dessert was delicate, perfectly balanced, each bite a testament to years of labor, resilience, and vision that none of them had ever believed I possessed. I let the sweetness linger on my tongue, serene in the knowledge that justice had finally been served. The bill had long been paid, just not by me. After 15 chapters of silence broken and masks torn away, the truth stood brighter than any chandelier above the Parker table. Betrayal had once been Emily's prison, but with patience and resolve, she transformed it into her battlefield, proving that injustice only reigns until courage demands its due. When arrogance collapsed under the weight of undeniable proof, the lesson became clear. No dynasty built on lies can outlast the quiet strength of perseverance. Justice may arrive late, but once it speaks, its echo cannot be silenced. Like, share, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. Comment 1 if you felt her struggle as your own, or 2 if you think the story still left you wanting more.